Now, African leaders met in the Ethiopian capital Addis Ababa for the annual summit aimed at accelerating implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area. Now, the creation of the African Union, or the AU, began with a wave of optimism about the continent's future. The organization now says peace and security have become more worrying than ever, and it's working to address the issue. Climate change, poverty, the outbreak of disease, and food shortages are all big issues. So, will the African Union be able to address these issues, and has the grouping lost its grip on the continent? Let's find out in this World of Africa special report.
Forget the summits and the photo ops of heads of state. To understand the forum, you have to go back to when it was born. The Organization of African Unity came into existence as a compromise between the radical Pan-Africanism of leaders such as Kwame Nkrumah, who advocated a union government and a continental military high command, and the more conservative outlook of the pro-Western leaders of Nigeria, Ivory Coast and Liberia, who insisted on a gradual approach to African economic and political integration. Fast forward to 2002, the OAU was renamed African Union. It was supposed to resolve the country's wars, ease the flow of trade across its borders, and help Africa to speak with one voice in world affairs. Unlike the OAU, which refused to interfere in the affairs of its members, the AU has the power to intervene without consent to stop a bloodbath. In other respects, though, the AU has come to resemble the talking shop it replaced. At each summit, it approves admirable-sounding schemes. Too few go anywhere.
The African Union is now more involved in regional crisis. It is more reactive, and it's discussing these issues quite often. What is not happening is putting money where the mouth is, and that is really the biggest problem, because we can discuss a lot about peace in Somalia or Ethiopia or whichever country, but as long as there is no financial resources or other resources like capacity to just build on these issues that we are discussing, then it's going to be a problem, and that has been a consistent challenge.
According to Afrobarometer, a polling firm, more than a third of Africans either think the AU is useless or have no opinion of it at all.
For a long time, people used to hear about African Union only during the summits. I mean, leaders go gather in Addis Ababa or whichever other city that the continental bloc may choose, and then they discuss and then issue a communique. But people are saying that what does as an ordinary civilian in Africa really need? They need a program that will ensure they have food on their table.
Apart from the war in Ukraine, all eyes are on the AU to see if it can achieve ceasefires in the Sahel and the eastern DRC, where M23 rebels have seized swaths of territory and sparked a diplomatic row between Kinshasa and Rwanda's government. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, who was a special guest at the 36th summit, urged African leaders to take action for peace and pushed the United Nations Security Council to consider enlisting Africa.
It is my deep belief that the biggest injustice that exists today in the Security Council is the lack of at least one African permanent member of the Security Council. When the Security Council was formed, there were very few African countries that were independent. So we have today a Security Council that corresponds to a reality that is no longer the reality of today's world.
If you look around the DRC, you will find that nearly every neighbor has an interest or two in that conflict. And therefore, solving that conflict will require that all the members participate and all of them are on the same page. The problem has been that everyone has been fighting for the last 30 years. So probably they need actual conviction that the alternative to fighting is better for everyone.
The Commission's dream of becoming something like the executive branch of the European Union has faded. Unlike the European Commission, it has no meaningful powers to enforce treaties or craft regulations. It was a tacit admission that the task of building a union greater than the sum of its parts remains unfinished. Bureau Report, WION, World is One.
Let's talk more about this status of the African Union. Professor Noah Midamba is a senior associate at the Global Center for Policy and Strategy. Professor is joining us from Nairobi, Kenya. Professor Noah, how would you evaluate the progress of the African Union this far?
Well, I can tell you this. I'm one of those people who've been very critical of African Union and how we are going. But I'm beginning to be very comfortable and beginning to see way forward and some really tangible result. Take, for instance, the East Africa community. East Africa community is now emerging into East and Central African community with 8 countries, including DR Congo. And then very quickly, we are going to have Somalia. And I know immediately after that, we'll have Ethiopia. So this will become the largest bloc of free trade for in Africa. And then that will influence the southern part, and then will influence the west and the northern part, so that Africa can truly become bloc. Just understand something. The US is the largest economy in the world with $25 trillion. Buried underneath of the DRC Congo, the mineral resources, is worth over $25 trillion. So if you take the DRC Congo alone and the mineral resources, plus all the forest and the fertile land, the DRC Congo is capable of feeding the entire continent of Africa. And so we need good governance. We need way forward. I have served in the University Council of East Africa for a long time, and I can tell you we are making significant progress about leadership of the university and aid that is coming in from various areas of the world, and how we can support and upgrade our ability to be able to run top quality universities in Africa. This is taking place.
Right. A major problem confronting the African Union is resources. Does that have an effect on the organization's ownership and its capabilities to intervene?
We don't lack resources in Africa. If you look at it, Africa, a few years from now, I hope it's in our time, will be one of the richest continents of Africa. There is no question about it. What is happening is management of those resources. Look at Congo. They're poor people. They're homeless people in Congo. There are over 500,000 people being displaced by this war in Congo. Why? Because we are fighting. And then other people have entered in from outside, both countries, like Russia, and Israel and all that, extracting the resources within Congo and taking it out at with no really understanding about the impact of it on the people. So Africa has to look inside. Africa must not continue to look at Europe and continue to look at the US and continue to look at Asia as a source of support for internal upheaval, which we have created ourselves.
All right, finally, Professor, what will it take for the African Union to be a strong grouping and diverse like the European Union? Will that ever happen, or is it just a pipe dream?
The leadership that is emerging in Africa is different from the pioneers like Jomo Kenyatta, Jamal Abdel Nasser. We have people that are much more practical, like Uhuru Kenyatta, which is looking at the internal dynamic and capacity of Africa to be able to move it up, so then we can begin to see ourselves for what we are, without thinking about the UN is going to help us with Amazon, and UN is going to help us in Congo, and UN is going to help us with the dispute within Sudan itself. And then we are also creating sanctions for those people that refuse to adhere to what is common knowledge for all of us. Now, this never happened under OAU. Everything was OAU. Everything was pushed to the side. But now we're beginning to look at each other and tell Ethiopian that you must stop, or we are going to cut you off from trading with you, and then your economy will go up, go down, and everything will go down. So I'm much more optimistic today than I was 5 or 10 years ago about the future of Africa.
Professor Noah Midamba, thank you very much for your insights and for talking to WION World is One, World of Africa.